Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
When we transform Nebraska corn into ethanol, it doesn't disappear from the food supply. It just takes a little detour. Ethanol is made from the starch. The rest of the corn becomes livestock feed to create meat and dairy products, corn oil, sweetener, and other food ingredients, and maybe a little carbon dioxide to make your soft drinks fizzy. Homegrown ethanol helps satisfy America's hunger for energy and the world's appetite for feed and food. Nebraska's family corn farmers, sustaining innovation.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Elaine looks at the USDA's June 30th reports. Wes Peterson talks about Brexit's impact on U.S. ag trade. Wayne Woldt outlines the FAA's new regulations for small unmanned aircraft systems. And Tom Hunt previews potential insect pressures. Elaine is our corn and soybean market analyst this week. The USDA believes U.S. farmers have increased both their corn and soybean acres since the agency's latest projection. The USDA's Acreage report, released Thursday, shows the country's growers bumping corn acres from 93.6 million to 94.1. It also sees soybean producers scaling acres up from 82.2 million acres to a record 83.7. The agency's quarterly grain stocks report tallied corn stocks up 6% from a year ago and soybean stocks up 39%. We talked with Elaine Thursday afternoon and started by asking for her thoughts on the latest numbers.
I think it's heartening to see that there was obviously some volatility right at the very beginning, like the microseconds after the report was announced, soybeans went from being double-digit down to being double-digit up. So it was a volatile day, but then the markets just kind of reverted into, normal fundamental patterns. So that was heartening to see that we're not too crazy there. And the takeaway, though, of the overall report, or of the overall performance by the end of the day, is that soybeans are the star of the show. They're definitely the leader. And new crop soybeans at that, those closed the day up 40 cents, whereas the nearby stuff really only closed up 30 cents.
Is my interpretation then that close, that high up, is not necessarily because of the reports? I think that's exactly what's happening here. It's kind of like that Brexit phenomenon where the markets are waiting and waiting to get these numbers or to get this result. But once the result is in and is known, once that information is known, now the markets, these are futures markets, the markets have to turn back to what is going to happen in the future. And for soybeans in particular, that future is looking dry. I mean, there's this La Nina looming threat for the late summer of dryness, and there's dryness now. There is some precipitation in the forecast for this upcoming week, but it's not going to hit some of the spots that are, most concerning folks in Iowa, even eastern South Dakota here. So I think the future is probably more bullish than these reports were, obviously. I think a lot of people, Elaine, were thinking that soybean acres would increase, but not necessarily an increase in corn acres. Can you explain what happened there?
Yeah, that was definitely the conventional wisdom going into this report, is that because during the planting time frame, same as now, the soybean to corn price ratio greatly favored soybeans. Not as much as it does now. Now, looking today, it's as high as these contracts has ever been. November soybeans are now 3 times higher than the price of December corn. But farmers, of course, did not respond to that economic motivation because farmers are going to plant corn for as much as they can plant corn. And most of the noise about prevented planting in the little pockets that had occurred was much later in the season when that would actually be preventing soybean planting more than corn planting. So yeah, the corn acres got in there and the soybean acres got in there, though not quite as much as the market was expecting.
How valuable do you think the grain stocks estimates were?
I think that they are always valuable. These are, direct data that is gone out and measured by the USDA, and that's useful to compare year over year. They were slightly bearish for both corn and soybeans, showing that our disappearance from March to May was less than what the trade or what the market was expecting to see going into this report. But note that that quarter we're talking about from March to May, that's missing some of the bullishness, especially for corn, the bullish stories that came in during June. So it's a backward-looking number, it's a real number, it's a valuable number, but I don't think that it fully incorporates some of the bullishness that we've got going on right now for the feed markets in both corn and soybean meal.
Yeah, you hinted at this then in soybeans, but where do we go from here in corn?
Well, I'm not terribly bullish for corn. I don't think there's a lot of upside because, as the quarterly stocks report did show, we're not using this up even as fast as we did last year. We're not on pace to do that. There's probably going to be 14.4 billion bushels of corn. There's going to be plenty of corn in the United States and lots of feed grains around the globe. So I don't see a lot of upside for corn. I do see this continued excitement from the investment side of the market to go into commodities or grains as an inflation hedge perhaps even, but this money could continue to flow in, and soybeans are benefiting from that right now. The entire sector could continue to benefit from that somewhat. So I'm slightly bullish on the entire sector, but I'm not talking about, $5 corn at this point. There's just not enough fundamental drought concern for that yet.
Where do you think the ceiling is on beans?
I think beans could retest their highs. It would be very unusual to see that happen, right? To see the new crop soybean market go up if the new crop corn market didn't do that at the same time. But this year we've seen them divorce already. We've seen them just completely ignore their usual price ratio. So I think it would be possible for November soybeans to get back above $11.75, maybe make a run at $12. That kind of thing could happen, but I'm not going to bet the farm on it. I think that, risk management just should still be in place.
Well, I'll close with this. What do crops look like up in your area, South Dakota?
Well, we would sure like to get some of this rain that's not in the forecast in the immediate term, but we'd like to see some of that. But generally speaking, yeah, it got planted well. It's a good crop. This is not this is not a 2012 crop that we're crazy concerned about at this point yet.
Next week, Roy Smith will join us to look at corn and soybean markets. Iowa State Extension livestock economist Lee Schultz will analyze the USDA's latest quarterly hogs and pigs report. World markets continued to react this week to the United Kingdom's recent referendum vote to leave the 28-member European Union. The UK is comprised of England, Scotland, and Wales within Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Exiting the EU could threaten international trade deals, including the prospective Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TTIP, the EU is currently negotiating with the United States. The UK government said before the June 23rd vote a withdrawal could take more than 2 years and lead to a decade of uncertainty. Wednesday morning, we talked with UNL Professor of Ag Economics Wes Peterson to learn how this could impact U.S. ag trade. We started by asking about the immediate impacts to the U.S. and world economies after the recent vote.
The main effect so far is a very short-term market volatility, particularly currency markets. I was looking at the pound. It was about just before the Brexit vote. It was the pound was $1.48. It fell to $1.31, and it's come back up now today to about $1.35. So there'll be a lot of currency volatility as happens with markets when they get shocked. Stock markets will also be volatile, but all of that, the stock market changes will smooth out. I mean, there's a tendency for these things to overshoot, and in a few months, I imagine the Dow will be back up where it was before this happened.
Can you give me a brief idea of why people wanted to leave the European Union?
The arguments that were made, one of the main items was immigration. People were worried about immigration, and the UK, I think, is more worried about immigration from Eastern Europe than from the Middle East and North Africa and so on. So that was one. There was a sort of a misinformation campaign that suggested that the UK would get back £300 million from a week from the European Union that they were sending at that stage to the European Union. And so now the other thing is, of course, that the UK has always been a little bit aloof from the continent, and there was a sense that somehow or another they would be better off economically outside. They wouldn't have to comply with European regulations and so on and so forth. I was surprised that they did it, and I think they're having second thoughts in the UK now. And of course the other repercussions, you don't know what Scotland and Northern Ireland are going to do, and so there's likely going to be a great deal of uncertainty for some time, and most businesses don't like that uncertainty very much. So,
what are the implications to trade?
Well, the UK overall is the biggest, is the fifth largest export market for the United States. They take about 5.5% of our total exports of goods and services from the United States. So that's a pretty good sized market overall. For agriculture, the UK is not nearly as significant a market. Our big markets in agriculture are NAFTA and Asia. And that's true for Nebraska as well. But the UK does take around 2% of our total U.S. agricultural exports. But in Nebraska, it's not a significant market for Nebraska. Nebraska exports about $3.1 billion worth of agricultural goods, and only about 4 million of that, which is just a little bit north of 1/10%, goes to the UK. So it's not going to affect Nebraska agriculture very much.
What do you think this means for TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership?
That's a very interesting question. It's hard to say. So there's a lot of uncertainty about that. I mean, basically, the U.S. will go ahead, as far as I can tell, will continue to negotiate. If Britain is out, we'll continue to negotiate and with the TTIP without Britain there. If Britain were in the European Union, we might expect that we would have an easier time negotiating a trade agreement with the EU, because the influence of the British as members of the European Union might moderate some of the demands that they might make.
Outside of that, though, the UK now operates independently for trade.
Basically,
or will operate.
Yeah, basically the great uncertainty about all of this stuff that will going forward is first of all, what will be the terms of the exit? If the UK invokes Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty, then that means they will set in motion a process that can take 2 years for them to get out. So they aren't going. It's not going to happen next week. They aren't going to be completely out of the EU next week. They may not be out of the EU for quite a long time. But once they do sort of get out, then the default would be that they would their trade policies would default to the rules of the World Trade Organization. But they would also then be able to negotiate trade agreements with all these other countries. And again, how they would do that would depend on the terms of their exit and so on, and that will take a long time. So basically, that again is one of the problems, the things that I think will bother people is the fact that if you're a business, you'd like to know what kinds of tariffs you're going to have to pay and what kinds of barriers you face for trading with countries, and that's going to be sort of uncertain for the foreseeable future, it seems to me.
Wes says he believes the TTIP will be difficult to negotiate, especially with the significant differences the potential partners face with respect to agriculture. The Federal Aviation Administration has finalized its first set of rules for operators of small unmanned aircraft systems, commonly known as drones. The regulations will take effect late next month and include stipulations on when and where people can fly their crafts. Pilots must be at least 16 years old and have proper certification requirements. Flights can take place during daylight and twilight hours, but some restrictions on flying may be eased through waivers. Earlier this week, we talked with Nebraska Extension's Woldt to learn more about the rules and started by asking about why these regulations exist.
Well, a lot of the reason is because of economic uses. Unmanned aircraft, which are now going to be legal to fly in our national airspace in about 60 days when the regulations become final and are fully implemented, have the potential for real significant economic impacts, especially to agriculture. In fact, agriculture is projected to be about 70% of the unmanned aircraft market going forward. And the unmanned aircraft market is projected to be huge, in the multiple billions of dollars. So there was a lot of economic pressure to bring this technology into our national airspace system to use for beneficial purposes. And if I can add, the technology itself is really advanced to where it can do amazing things.
Wayne, you fly about once a week over a lot of crop ground. What do you think are the benefits to using drones? What are the challenges?
Well, the unmanned aircraft provides such a view of landscapes. It's an unparalleled view and fairly difficult to get otherwise, from the ground, for example. So that view, when you're managing large parcels of land, is just incredibly powerful.
And the challenges?
Challenges are tied mostly to the rules, understanding the rules and regulations, the technology. There's some training involved with the technology to really get proficient with it. But otherwise, it's just bringing it together and implementing it.
What has changed? What does a producer or a farmer or a crop consultant need to know if they want to use this kind of technology?
To fly an unmanned aircraft, you need to have what's called a remote control pilot certificate. So there's a new pilot certificate that's going to be available under these rules. You attain that certificate by either passing a test, or if you're an existing manned aviation pilot, you take a short online training session.
Walk me through a flight. What can you do? What can't you do under these new regulations?
The rules themselves are quite voluminous. There's a lot of rules. It's called Part 107 of the Federal Aviation Regulations. And basically what they do is they allow for commercial flight of unmanned aircraft that now can be used in a setting similar to what other aircraft are used, except there are altitude limitations. For example, unmanned aircraft are currently limited to 400 foot above ground level. That's the maximum height that they can be flown.
So is there line of sight regulations? Can you fly over certain areas? Can you not fly over others?
Yes, the line of sight is a requirement. That's a pretty big requirement, that unmanned aircraft need to remain within what's called visual line of sight of the pilot in command or a visual observer. And that has to be unaided visual line of sight. In other words, you can't use binoculars to help with that. It has to be by the eye or with corrective lenses.
But otherwise, the old rules said that a hobbyist could use it. A farmer could go use it, scout his crops, but not necessarily use that information, correct? And now under these new rules, you can use it for any purpose you wish?
Yes, commercial use is going to be legal.
What's the privacy issue with these regulations?
Well, the regulations themselves don't address privacy. The Federal Aviation Administration, which is responsible for maintaining the safety of our national airspace, and they're also the ones that wrote these rules, are not charged by Congress to deal with privacy issues. The Federal Aviation Administration views privacy as more of a local issue. So it could be a local regulation or state regulation, but the rules themselves are moot or silent on the issue of privacy.
So I can fly a drone over your land legally?
That's correct, as long as you follow the Federal Aviation rules and regulations. Just like any other aircraft can fly over my land legally. But those aircraft that are flying over my land would need to follow the aviation rules. For piloted aircraft, the minimum altitude you typically are allowed to go would be 1,000 foot above ground level.
This question has been asked before, but the landowner, do they have any rights? Can they make any action as in shoot the drone down?
Shooting at an aircraft is illegal. That's a federal law. And since the Federal Aviation Administration defines unmanned aircraft as aircraft, they also fall under that rule that it makes it against the law to shoot at an aircraft.
On the Market Journal website, we'll link to the FAA's operational rules for commercial use of small unmanned aircraft systems. The USDA's most recent crop progress report lists 79% of Nebraska's corn in good to excellent condition, 4 points better than the national average. The agency rates 78% of the state's beans in the top 2 categories, 6 points better than the country as a whole. And in alfalfa, Nebraska's National Agricultural Statistics Service puts 82% of the crop as good to excellent as the second cutting begins. To look at potential insect pressures to each crop, we talked recently with Nebraska Extension entomologist Tom Hunt and started by looking at pests in alfalfa.
We didn't have too much early. We had a few alfalfa weevils, but now and later on this year it's time to start looking for potato leaf hoppers. You know, they blow up from the south and are often carried in weather systems, so a good idea is when we have one of those weather patterns that comes up from Texas or from different places, is after that's come through, the next day or so when it's dry enough, go check your alfalfa. And I think what I'd probably be particularly looking for is probably potato leaf hopper. Another one that is around and I've heard is out and about are little grasshoppers. They're in the brome. They're very tiny now. Usually rains, and a lot of rains results in a disease that kind of keeps their population low, but that is something to think about. So if you're seeing those on the edges of your alfalfa or in it, or even other crops, that's another one to keep an eye out for. But yeah, potato leaf hopper and alfalfa is what I'd start looking for.
Let's move into corn. What can producers be scouting for over the next couple weeks here?
Well, pretty soon, Julie Peterson out of North Platte is going to have a crop watch article along with some other authors this week or next week, I think, talking about western bean cutworm flight initiation and how to predict it. We did some research to determine when you can start predicting the flight, and that'll help the farmers kind of focus when they can start scouting. And you know, we have light traps at various stations so they can go online to the university, check those out. We also have a sampling plan that'll be in that article that if once they do start sampling, they can use that. And so that'll come out soon. So I'd start looking around for you know, some of those leps, and western bean cutworm is one I'd be focusing on.
How dangerous can that cutworm be?
Well, it can be significant. It's always a pest somewhere in western Nebraska, southwestern Nebraska. And it's periodically a pest in northeast Nebraska. And we just don't know when it's going to be a bad year. Although out there, typically, there are always going to be some fields that get hit. And they start out going up to the tassel, then moving down to the ear, and they feed on kernels, so they can directly damage your ear that way. And then there's some issues, particularly in some other parts of the country, with mycotoxins. I mean, whenever you damage an ear like that with ear feeding, there's other insects that get in there and maybe some mycotoxins and things like that. So it is a significant pest where it is a problem, yeah.
Let's finish in soybeans. What's the schedule for soybeans?
Well, soybean has been pretty calm so far, but it's once we get to the end of June and early July, that's when I start picking up the very few number of soybean aphids. And so when we get into July, you'll want to put that on your schedule, because that's something that's become the most significant pest of soybean in North America right now. And so most significant soybean insect pest. Lauren Giesler would argue that the cyst nematode is, and he's probably right. But of insects, it's the soybean aphid. So I would start scouting for that, you know, start thinking about that in July.
You want to reinforce to me why you might not want to control that right away, or why you might want to wait till a certain threshold in soybean aphid?
Yes, that's a good point. This is the type of insect that if you spray it too early, it can reinfest, either by remigrating in, or when you spray early before it's built up, you knock out all the natural enemies, which help keep it down or at least slow its population growth. So then those surviving ones or others that migrate in don't have anything to keep it down, and so they just ramp up. So in Nebraska, we're pretty lucky. We usually get our infestations and have to treat, you know, if we do, in later July, August. And if you get that one good treatment during that time, when they go past that threshold of about 250 per plant, usually that's the only one treatment is enough. Some other parts of the country where they start earlier, they actually have to spray a couple times sometimes.
Next week, Nebraska Extension entomologist Bob Wright will join us to further discuss grasshopper control. Now with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension Ag climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we again for the weekly forecast. Now, as we head into the big holiday weekend, of course, the big item on everybody's mind is, will we continue to see some of the scattered thunderstorm activity that hit more western Nebraska and miss much of eastern Nebraska? And will we also see an increase in temperatures as we head into the pollination period? You know, from the drought monitor standpoint, we've now seen an increase in abnormally dry conditions in the western corn belt. And unfortunately, some of the areas that seen the good precipitation in western Nebraska were visited by, unfortunately, the white combine. But in eastern Nebraska, where we desperately need some of that precipitation to alleviate some of the heat stress, we're just not getting a well-rounded precipitation events in the region. Although they're scattered, some are being lucky, most people are being left high and dry. So as we go through this weekend, there's a couple other chances for precipitation, and we're going to need to see this precipitation because, as you see from the latest drought monitor that takes us through Tuesday morning of this week, we have expanded the abnormally dry conditions to south central, southeast, and central Nebraska, with portions of east central Nebraska also included in that. And we've seen some relaxation of the abnormally dry conditions to our east. The good news is there's several more waves projected to come through the region that may give us an opportunity for precipitation. The bad news is, as we get into next week, we start to see a warming trend as the ridge starts to build back in. The good news is, as you look out farther into the future, we do not see a blocking ridging pattern to bring the heat in sustained fashion over the central plains out to the 2-week period. So we're seeing continuation of warmed movement to cool, warm to cool, and that's a pattern that does offer us chances for precipitation. So when we look at the upper air model for today, we can see that we have a trough over the Great Lakes region. You'll notice this red area here. This is an area of maximum lift, showing that the models are indicating we should see another precipitation event develop during the day today, and that will move toward the southeast and will include portions of northern Nebraska or northern Kansas and southeast Nebraska. The heavy precipitation lines up right at the Kansas border, so any northward drift would give us an opportunity for some significant moisture, at least across some of the areas that are being shown as abnormally dry. As we go into Sunday, we still see some of this residual troughing pattern across eastern Nebraska, so there is again the opportunity for some carryover thunderstorm activity, particularly across southeastern Nebraska, and a little bit of isolated pop-up thunderstorm activity across central Nebraska. Now as we go into Monday, all of that energy moves to our east. It looks to be a very good day for the 4th of July holiday. Doesn't look like being any inclement weather that will impede the 4th of July fireworks display, but at the same token, we start to see the ridge building back in, bringing the heat into our region. As we go into Tuesday, that ridge remains firmly in plant, so we're going to be back up into the upper 80s, low 90s, and as we get into Wednesday, the ridge builds even farther to the north, and I would not be surprised that we'll start to visit the upper 90s region across central and eastern Nebraska. As we go into Thursday, now we start to see a trough pushing into our region, but we're still going to be in the influence of subsiding air where we're indicated by this blue, so we're going to continue to see warm temperatures, and by Friday, we start to increase our chances for thunderstorms, and as we go into next week, and this looks to be a weather maker for us in terms of precipitation. The 8 to 14-day forecast keeps the warm conditions in place and actually moves them to the east, and as we look at the precipitation, we see that eastern Nebraska is on the western periphery of above normal moisture.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews are available individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on the USDA's latest reports, the UK's exit from the European Union, regulations for drone use, and insect pressures in crops. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Next week, Roy Smith will look at corn and soybean markets, and U.S. Grains Council Chairman Alan Tiemann will discuss the recent expansion of the Panama Canal. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.